My presentation discusses how a parent's failure to ensure accommodations of a child's learning disability is tantamount to parental abuse and neglect. Parents have a legal and moral obligation to provide their children with necessaries of life. In the case of most children, necessaries of life include food, shelter, medical attention, and protection from harm. If a child has a physical mobility issue, they are entitled to an additional necessary in the form of a wheelchair. Similarly, a child who has a learning disability is entitled to additional necessaries to support their learning disability. In the case of a child with a learning disability, this support is referred to as accommodation. I contend that a parent who fails to ensure that their child with a learning disability is properly accommodated has effectively neglected and abused their child in what can be referred to as a mission to provide a necessary of life. Abuse or neglect in the form of failure to accommodate or under-accommodate a child with a learning disability could manifest in child as anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, or social withdrawal, and in extreme circumstances, suicide. According to Breer et al. In 2017 study, as with physical and sexual abuse, disengaged parents can also have a significant long-term negative impact on the future of mental health in the child. This includes parents who actively reject or dismiss their children's needs, those who are intentionally absent, and those who lack awareness and attention to their children's best interests. Each of these conducts are tantamount to abuse and neglect, in the form in case of a child with a learning disability. On the impact of cultural, ethnic, and geographic differences, Kuleg, in a 2015 study, found that children's perceived parental indifferences and or neglect has significant correlation with the psychological maladjustment and negative personality outcomes, with no differences between cultures, ethnicities, and geographic locations. The solution to this parental neglect dilemma is an absolute need to educate parents, clinicians, and child life specialists as to the right of the child. The legal and moral obligation of the parent is to advocate on behalf of and thereby protect the child. Ng et al. In 2015 study found that rehabilitation professionals who frequently perform advocacy work on behalf of children with disabilities lack sufficient knowledge, advocacy expertise to competently advocate on behalf of children with disabilities. This includes the need for an understanding of local processes and structures that the practitioners must navigate, including awareness of both policies and available research materials. The same would apply to parents. A 2018 study by Fuller, Thompson, Carroll, and Yang found that 1 in 6 women with learning disabilities had attempted suicide, that people with learning disabilities who had been exposed to chronic parental domestic violence or childhood sexual abuse had twice the risk of suicide attempts. Another study in 1997 by McBridle and Siegel analyzed suicide notes written by teens and found that 89% of those authors had significant deficits in spelling and handwriting that were similar to those of adolescents with learning disabilities. Such a mission could give rise to both criminal sanctions, moral denouncements, and interventions by social service agencies. I further contend that such a failure is often unintentional and is facilitated primarily by parental lack of understanding of their legal obligation to facilitate accommodation, and their failure to understand their child's constitutional and human rights. Specifically, a child has the legal right to have equal access to education, which includes the right to fully participate. A child with a learning disability who is not properly accommodated does not have the necessary tools to allow them to access education, fully participate, and have equal chance to academically succeed. There is a demonstration correlation between disabilities and child neglect and mistreatment. Spencer, Devereaux, Wallace et al. In a 2005 study found a strong child abuse registry association with children noted to have learning disabilities and conduct disorders, primarily due to a shared common ideological pathway related to parental neglect and child abuse. There has also been found to be a reverse causal connection in that there is an increased incidence of disability in those children who have been neglected or abused. There is, however, no proven causal connection that supports a conclusion that any particular condition or disability predisposes a child to abuse. To summarize, failure to provide one's child with food, water, and shelter is no different than failure to provide a child who has a learning disability with appropriate accommodations. In all of these instances, failure to provide any of these necessaries is neglect and abuse, which can have a severe negative mental health impact on the child. Absent, inattentive, and preoccupied parents who do not advocate on behalf of their child who has a learning disability are abusers from both a legal and moral standpoint. Ignorance is not an excuse or a defense. Unaccommodated or underaccommodated children with learning disabilities are at high risk for a multitude of negative health outcomes and are at a higher risk of suicide. Parental education is required in order to support and protect these children. Ableism is discrimination against persons who have a disability, treating them as dependent, deficient, and an anomaly of nature. The Ontario Human Rights Commission considers ableism to be a systemic problem in learning institutions. Societal failure to ensure that parents, educators, and professionals are made aware of these rights and obligations make us all complicit in this unrecognized form of abuse.